This story is based on true events, and I warn you, it is not for the faint of heart. If you decide to continue, remember, you have been warned. I never believed in the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and haunted houses were mere tales to me. But everything changed when I moved into 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville. It was a cold, damp November night when I arrived at the house. Rain poured down in torrents, drumming against my car's windshield as I pulled into the driveway. The house loomed, dark and foreboding against the night sky, its broken windows and dilapidated exterior exuding an air of abandonment. There was something profoundly wrong with the place, but I couldn't pinpoint what it was. As I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The door creaked like a scream of agony, echoing through the darkened hallways. The smell of mold and decay assaulted my nostrils, making me feel nauseous. The walls, stained and cracked, seemed to whisper ancient secrets, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The first night was uneventful, though sleep eluded me. The house groaned and creaked, settling into its foundation, or so I thought. Shadows danced in the corners of my vision, but I dismissed them as tricks of the mind. I had to convince myself that the unease I felt was simply due to the newness of the place. The following days were no better. The air inside the house felt heavy, oppressive. Every step I took echoed through the empty rooms, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I decided to explore the house more thoroughly, hoping to find some rational explanation for the unsettling atmosphere. The basement was the worst. As I descended the creaky wooden stairs, the air grew colder, and the smell of damp earth filled my lungs. The basement was dark, the only light coming from a single, flickering bulb. As I looked around, I noticed something odd. The walls were covered in strange markings, almost like symbols. They were faint, but they seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. I dismissed the symbols as graffiti from previous occupants, but a sense of dread lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong with the house. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time, a low, guttural whisper coming from the darkness. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it sent shivers down my spine. "Get out!" I bolted upright, heart pounding. The room was empty, the whisper gone. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Something was in the house with me, something that didn't want me there. Over the next few weeks, the activity escalated. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and the whispers grew louder. I began to see things, figures in the corners of my vision, dark shapes that disappeared when I looked directly at them. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence looming over me, watching, waiting. One night, I woke to find my bedroom door wide open. I knew I had closed it before going to bed. I got up, heart pounding, and walked to the door. As I reached for the handle, a cold hand grabbed my wrist. I yanked my arm back, but there was nothing there. My wrist tingled with the cold, as if it had been dipped in ice water. I couldn't stay there any longer. I needed answers. I began to research the house's history, desperate to find some explanation for the horrors I was experiencing. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The house had a dark past, filled with tragedy and death. The DeFeo family had been murdered in their beds by their eldest son, Ronnie DeFeo Jr., who claimed he had heard voices urging him to kill. The subsequent occupants, the Lutz family, reported terrifying paranormal activity, which had driven them to flee after just 28 days. But there was more. The land the house was built on had a history of violence and suffering dating back to the Native American Shinnecock tribe, who believed the site to be cursed. The house had been built over an ancient burial ground, a place of great evil. Armed with this knowledge, I contacted a local priest, Father O'Malley, who agreed to bless the house. As he sprinkled holy water and recited prayers, the atmosphere grew tense. The walls seemed to pulse, and the air grew thick with a malevolent presence. "Leave this place," Father O'Malley warned me. "There is a darkness here that cannot be cleansed." I was stubborn. I didn't want to abandon the house, my investment. But that night, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. "Get out! Get out!" The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Shadows moved on their own, and the temperature dropped to freezing. I saw them clearly for the first time. Figures, distorted and horrifying, their eyes glowing with malevolence. I knew I had to leave. I packed what I could and fled the house, never looking back. As I drove away, I could still hear the whispers, echoing in my mind. "Get out!" I never returned to 112 Ocean Avenue. The house still stands, a monument to the darkness that resides within. And though I have tried to move on, the memories haunt me. I can still feel the cold hand on my wrist, still hear the whispers in the night. The house in Amityville is more than just a building. It is a place of evil, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurs. And for those who dare to enter, it is a place of unimaginable terror. Months passed, but the nightmares didn't. My sleep was plagued by visions of the house, of the figures that lurked within its walls. I couldn't escape the memories, no matter how far I ran. The darkness of 112 Ocean Avenue had taken root in my mind, festering like an infection. Desperate for answers, I reached out to George and Kathy Lutz, the previous occupants who had fled in terror. They were reluctant to speak at first, but I convinced them to meet with me. Over coffee in a quiet diner, they recounted their experiences, their faces pale with remembered fear. "It started small," Kathy said, her voice trembling. "Cold spots, strange noises. But it got worse. Much worse." George nodded, his eyes haunted. "I saw things. Horrible things. Shadows that moved on their own. Eyes staring at us from the darkness. The house was alive, feeding off our fear." Their story mirrored my own experiences, but what they told me next was even more disturbing. They had consulted a demonologist, who believed the house was infested with a powerful, malevolent entity. An exorcism had been attempted but failed, and the Lutzes had no choice but to flee. "You need to stay away," George warned me. "The house will consume you. It's already started." I didn't want to believe them, but deep down, I knew they were right. The house had left its mark on me, and the darkness was spreading. My friends noticed the change, my growing paranoia, the dark circles under my eyes. They tried to help, but nothing could alleviate the terror that gripped my soul. One night, as I lay in bed, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. I found myself back in the house, standing in the basement. The walls pulsed with a sickly light, and the symbols glowed with an unholy energy. I could hear the whispers, louder and more insistent than ever. "Join us! Join us!" I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The shadows closed in around me, their eyes glowing with malevolence. I felt a hand on my shoulder, cold and clammy, and I turned to see a figure, its face twisted in a grotesque grin. "Welcome home," it hissed. I woke with a scream, drenched in sweat. The terror was too real, too immediate. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was calling to me, pulling me back into its dark embrace. In a moment of desperation, I decided to return to Amityville. I had to confront the darkness, to face whatever evil resided in the house. Armed with holy water and a crucifix, I drove back to 112 Ocean Avenue, my heart pounding with fear and determination. The house looked the same, dark and foreboding against the night sky. As I stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the familiar smell of decay filled my nostrils. The whispers started immediately, a low, guttural chant that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Join us! Join us!" I made my way to the basement, where the symbols still glowed with a malevolent light. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. I sprinkled holy water on the walls, reciting prayers, but the whispers only grew louder. The shadows moved, coalescing into a form, a figure with glowing eyes and a twisted grin. It reached out to me, its hand cold and clammy. I raised the crucifix, but the figure only laughed, a sound that sent chills down my spine. "You cannot escape," it hissed. "You are ours." I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to stand my ground. I continued to recite prayers, my voice shaking but determined. The figure recoiled, its eyes burning with rage. "Leave this place," I commanded. "In the name of God, leave this place." The figure screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the symbols on the walls flared with an intense light. The air crackled with energy, and I felt a force pushing me back, driving me out of the basement. I stumbled up the stairs, the whispers following me, growing more frantic. I could feel the darkness closing in, but I forced myself to keep moving. As I reached the front door, a final whisper echoed in my mind. "Join us!" I fled the house, never looking back. The experience left me shaken, but I knew I had to share my story. The house in Amityville is a place of unimaginable horror, a place where the darkness is alive, feeding off the fear and suffering of those who dare to enter. I never returned to 112 Ocean Avenue, but the memories haunt Maine. The darkness is always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder of the terror I faced. The house still stands, a monument to the evil that resides within, and for those who dare to enter, it is a place of unimaginable terror. Despite my best efforts, I couldn't escape the memories of Amityville. The darkness had taken root in my mind, festering like an infection. Every night I was plagued by nightmares, visions of the house, of the figures that lurked within its walls. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence looming over me, watching, waiting. Desperate for answers, I reached out to paranormal investigators, hoping they could shed some light on the horrors I had experienced. I met with Ed and Lorraine Warren, renowned demonologists who had investigated the Amityville house in the past. They listened to my story with grave expressions, their faces pale with remembered fear. "The house is a conduit," Ed explained, "a gateway to the other side. The darkness there is ancient, powerful. It feeds on fear, growing stronger with every victim." Lorraine nodded, her eyes haunted. "You're connected to it now. It won't let you go easily. You must find a way to break the bond, or it will consume you." Their words filled me with a sense of dread, but also determination. I had to find a way to rid myself of the darkness, to sever the connection to the house. I began to research rituals and exorcisms, anything that might help. One night, I decided to perform a cleansing ritual in my own home, hoping to banish the dark presence that haunted me. I gathered candles, holy water, and a crucifix, and began to recite prayers. As I did, the air grew cold, and the whispers started, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Join us! Join us!" I forced myself to continue, my voice shaking but determined. The candles flickered, and I could feel the darkness closing in around me. I raised the crucifix, reciting the Lord's Prayer, but the whispers only grew louder. Suddenly, the candles were snuffed out, plunging the room into darkness. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice hissed in my ear. "You cannot escape!" I screamed, stumbling back. The room was filled with shadows, moving and writhing like living things. I grabbed the holy water, splashing it around me, and the shadows recoiled with a hiss. "You are ours!" the voice whispered. "You belong to us." I continued to recite prayers, my voice shaking but determined. The darkness seemed to pulse, growing thicker and more oppressive. I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to stand my ground. "Leave this place," I commanded. "In the name of God, leave this place." The darkness screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the air crackled with energy. I felt a force pushing me back, driving me to my knees. But I continued to pray, my voice growing stronger. "Leave this place." The darkness seemed to waver, and I felt a glimmer of hope. But then, with a final agonized scream, it surged forward, enveloping me completely. I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my throat, and the world went black. When I woke, I was lying on the floor, the room bathed in a sickly green light. The shadows were gone, but the air was thick with a sense of malevolence. I could still hear the whispers, faint but insistent, echoing in my mind. "Join us!" I knew then that the darkness would never truly leave me. The house in Amityville had marked me, and the evil that resided there had taken root in my soul. No matter where I went, the whispers would follow, a constant reminder of the terror I had faced. The darkness followed me everywhere, a constant, malevolent presence. I couldn't escape it, no matter how far I ran. The whispers echoed in my mind, growing louder with each passing day. "Join us! Join us!" I knew I had to confront the source of the evil once and for all. I couldn't live like this, with the darkness always lurking in the corners of my mind. I had to return to Amityville, to 112 Ocean Avenue, and face whatever evil resided there. I contacted Father O'Malley once again, and he agreed to accompany me. We gathered our supplies, holy water, crucifixes, and prayer books, and set off for the house. The drive was tense, the air heavy with anticipation. As we arrived, the house loomed before us, dark and foreboding against the night sky. The windows seemed to glow with a sickly light, and the air was thick with a sense of malevolence. We stepped inside, and the door creaked shut behind us, sealing us in with the darkness. The air was cold, and the smell of decay filled my nostrils. The whispers started immediately, a low, guttural chant that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Join us! Join us!" We made our way to the basement, where the symbols still glowed with an unholy light. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and I could feel the darkness closing in around us. Father O'Malley began to recite prayers, sprinkling holy water on the walls. The shadows moved, coalescing into a form, a figure with glowing eyes and a twisted grin. It reached out to us, its hand cold and clammy. Father O'Malley raised the crucifix, his voice strong and unwavering. "Leave this place," he commanded. "In the name of God, leave this place." The figure screamed, a sound of pure agony, and the symbols on the walls flared with an intense light. The air crackled with energy, and I felt a force pushing me back, driving me to my knees. But Father O'Malley continued to pray, his voice growing stronger. "Leave this place." The darkness seemed to waver, and I felt a glimmer of hope. But then, with a final agonized scream, it surged forward, enveloping us completely. I felt a cold, clammy hand close around my throat, and the world went black. When I woke, I was lying on the floor, the room bathed in a sickly green light. The shadows were gone, but the air was thick with a sense of malevolence. Father O'Malley lay beside me, unconscious but breathing. I knew then that the darkness had not been banished. The house in Amityville was still a place of unimaginable horror, a place where the line between the living and the dead blurred. And for those who dared to enter, it was a place of unimaginable terror. I never returned to 112 Ocean Avenue, but the memories haunt Maine. The darkness is always there, lurking in the corners of my mind, a constant reminder of the terror I faced. The house still stands, a monument to the evil that resides within, and for those who dare to enter, it is a place of unimaginable terror. For I am a witness to the darkness, a survivor of the horror that is Amityville, and though I have tried to move on, the memories remain, a constant reminder of the evil that lurks in the shadows. This story is based on true events, and I warn you, it is not for the faint of heart. If you decide to continue, remember, you have been warned. I had never imagined that a place so steeped in history could harbor such malevolence. Salem, Massachusetts, is synonymous with the infamous witch trials of 1692, a name that conjures images of darkness and despair. I had read about Salem, watched documentaries, and even scoffed at the folklore. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality that awaited me as I arrived on a cold October afternoon. The town of Salem greeted me with its quintessential New England charm. The cobblestone streets were lined with ancient oaks, their gnarled branches stretching like skeletal fingers against the dim, overcast sky. I drove past historic homes, their facades painted in muted shades of grey and brown, some adorned with meticulously carved pumpkins for Halloween. Yet, beneath this veneer of quaintness, I could sense something unervingly sinister. An oppressive weight hung in the air, as if the very essence of the town was holding its breath. I had come to Salem to escape the suffocating routine of city life, to find solace in the shadows of history. The bed and breakfast where I had booked my stay was situated on the outskirts of town, away from the bustle of tourists and souvenir shops. It was an old, Victorian-era house that seemed to have been lifted straight from the pages of a Gothic novel. Its dark wooden shingles were weathered and curling at the edges, and the wrought iron fence surrounding the property was rusted, as though it had long since given up the battle against time. The front porch creaked under my weight as I approached the heavy oak door, its surface marred by decades of neglect. I paused before entering, taking in the eerie silence that enveloped the house. It felt as though the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to cross the threshold. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. Inside, the house was even more unsettling. The air was thick with the musty scent of decay, mingling with the faintest hint of mildew. The hallway was dimly lit by a single, flickering chandelier whose crystals tinkled softly, like distant, mournful whispers. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, adorned with intricate floral patterns that seemed to writhe and twist under the dim light. The floors creaked with every step I took, and the staircase, with its dark, polished wood, seemed to lead into an abyss of shadows. As I made my way to the reception area, I noticed an old-fashioned grandfather clock standing in the corner, its pendulum swinging with a slow, rhythmic tick-tock. The sound was strangely disquieting, each tick echoing through the empty halls like a heartbeat in the silence. The walls were adorned with antique portraits, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes that seemed to follow my every movement. It was as though they were silently judging me, their expressions frozen in time. The woman who greeted me at the reception desk was elderly, her face etched with deep lines that spoke of countless years spent in the shadows of the past. Her eyes were a startlingly bright blue, but they seemed to hold an unsettling glimmer of something dark and unfathomable. She welcomed me with a thin, almost imperceptible smile that did little to dispel the growing sense of unease. As she handed me the key to my room, her fingers brushed mine, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable shiver run down my spine. "Welcome to the Hawthorne House," she said in a voice that was soft, but carried an undercurrent of something unsettling. "I hope you find your stay enlightening." I forced a smile and nodded, though her words left me with an uneasy feeling that I couldn't quite shake. As I ascended the creaking staircase to my room, I couldn't help but feel as though the house itself was watching me, its darkened corners holding secrets that were best left undisturbed. My room was located at the end of a long, dimly lit corridor. The door, adorned with an old brass number plate, opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a space that seemed to be frozen in time. The furnishings were antique, covered in dust and cobwebs, as if the room had not been used in years. A large, canopied bed stood in the center, its heavy drapes drawn tight, and a fireplace sat dormant, its mantel cluttered with relics that had long since lost their purpose. I set my bags down and approached the window, hoping to find some comfort in the view outside. The window looked out over a sprawling garden that had been overtaken by neglect. The once pristine lawn was now a tangled mass of weeds and overgrown grass, and the hedges were so unkempt that they seemed to form twisted, menacing shapes in the fading light. The only thing that stood out was a large, wrought-iron gate at the far end of the garden, its bars rusted and bowed. As dusk settled over the town, the shadows in my room grew longer, stretching out like dark tendrils that seemed to claw at the edges of my vision. The air grew colder, and I found myself shivering despite the warmth of the room. I tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was settling over me, attributing it to the unfamiliar surroundings and the eerie atmosphere of the house. That night, as I lay in bed, I found it impossible to sleep. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. The darkness seemed to press in on me from all sides, and every small sound was magnified, turning the night into a cacophony of unsettling noises. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching me, and the oppressive sense of dread only deepened with every passing minute. In the dead of night, a sudden piercing noise shattered the silence, a loud, echoing bang that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the house. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, straining to hear any further sounds. There was nothing but silence, heavy and suffocating, and I was left alone with my racing thoughts and the palpable sense of foreboding that clung to the air. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, that the noise was nothing more than a figment of my imagination. But as I lay back down, trying to calm my frayed nerves, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The shadows in my room seemed to move and shift, their dark forms twisting and elongating in the dim light of the moon. And somewhere, deep within the bowels of the Hawthorne House, I could have sworn I heard the faintest, most mournful whisper, as though the house itself was lamenting the arrival of a new occupant. Little did I know that this was just the beginning. The true horror of Salem was waiting, hidden in the shadows, ready to reveal itself when I least expected it. The house seemed to breathe with a life of its own, and as I lay there in the darkness, I couldn't help but feel that I was no longer alone. I barely slept that night. The fear and unease that had settled over me seemed to cling to the very fabric of my being, making every creak of the old house seem magnified and ominous. By morning I was exhausted, but a sense of determination pushed me to explore the town of Salem, hoping to find some distraction from the oppressive atmosphere of the Hawthorne House. The day was overcast, with a heavy grey sky threatening rain. Salem streets were lined with colonial-style buildings, their historic charm only serving to deepen the sense of foreboding that clung to me. I visited the Witch Museum and the old Burying Point Cemetery, where the sombre gravestones seemed to tell tales of despair and tragedy. Despite the town's attempts to present a historical facade, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the shadows. In the afternoon, I returned to the Hawthorne House, feeling an unshakable sense of dread. As I approached the house, I noticed a peculiar change in the atmosphere. The garden, which had seemed so bleak the day before, now appeared almost surreal. The overgrown grass seemed to have been trimmed, and the wrought-iron gate, though still rusty, looked as if it had been polished. The whole scene seemed too neat, too deliberate, as though someone, or something, was preparing for my arrival. That evening, as the sun set and darkness began to creep in, I decided to investigate the house more thoroughly. I had noticed a door at the end of the hallway on the second floor, partially concealed behind a heavy, faded curtain. It was unusual in its positioning, and I felt an inexplicable pull toward it. The door was old and heavily lacquered, with an ornate brass handle that was cold to the touch. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, and I was greeted by a room that had clearly been abandoned for decades. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. The room was filled with old furniture covered in white sheets, their shapes ghostly and indistinct. At the far end of the room was an old, ornate mirror with a tarnished silver frame. Its surface was covered in grime, and it seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dim light. As I approached the mirror, I felt a chill run down my spine. The glass, despite its filth, seemed to hold a strange, almost hypnotic quality. I leaned in closer, trying to see my reflection through the haze. Suddenly, I noticed a figure behind me in the mirror, an apparition of a woman dressed in old-fashioned, tattered clothing. Her face was obscured by shadows, but I could see her eyes, dark and hollow, staring at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. I spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, and the unsettling feeling in my chest grew stronger. I turned back to the mirror, but the apparition was gone. I wiped the dust from the glass, but my own reflection stared back at me, looking pale and shaken. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the next few days digging into the history of the Hawthorne House and the town of Salem. I visited the local library and pored over old records and newspapers. The more I learned, the more I realized that the house was not merely a relic of the past. It was a nexus of dark and disturbing events. According to the records, the Hawthorne House had been owned by a wealthy merchant named Jonathan Hawthorne in the late 19th century. He had been a reclusive man, and rumors swirled about his involvement in occult practices. The house had been the site of several unexplained deaths, including that of his daughter, Eliza, who had vanished without a trace. The circumstances surrounding these events were shrouded in mystery, but it was clear that something malevolent had taken root in the house. One evening, as I was returning to the house, I noticed a figure standing by the wrought-iron gate in the garden. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its features obscured. I approached cautiously, but as I drew closer, the figure vanished into the shadows, leaving me with a sense of impending doom. I tried to shake off the encounter, but it only deepened my sense of paranoia. That night, I was awoken by a series of terrifying noises, thumps, dragging sounds, and whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the house. I tried to rationalize these disturbances as the creaks and groans of an old building, but the sounds were too rhythmic, too deliberate to be anything but intentional. My fear reached its peak when I heard a voice whispering my name from the darkness. It was a cold, raspy voice, filled with an anger and sadness that seemed to pierce through my very soul. Unable to bear the tension any longer, I decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I gathered my courage and ventured into the basement, a place I had been avoiding due to its oppressive darkness. The basement was even more unsettling than the rest of the house. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old, dusty jars, their contents long since decomposed. In the center of the room was an old altar, covered in strange symbols and arcane objects. As I examined the altar, I noticed a journal lying on the floor. Its leather cover was cracked and worn, and the pages were yellowed with age. I opened it, and the entries were written in a hurried, scrawling hand. The journal belonged to Jonathan Hawthorne, and it detailed his descent into madness. His writings spoke of rituals and sacrifices, of summoning entities from beyond the grave. The final entry was a chilling confession. The shadows have taken her. They are hungry, and they will not rest until they have claimed all that is theirs. As I read the final lines, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the basement, and the temperature dropped abruptly. I looked up, and the shadows seemed to come alive, swirling around me with an almost tangible malevolence. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices filled with rage and sorrow. The shadows began to coalesce into shapes, dark, writhing forms that seemed to reach out toward me. I fled the basement, my heart pounding in my chest. I raced up the stairs and into my room, locking the door behind me. The shadows seemed to follow me, their presence a constant, suffocating pressure. I could hear their whispers, their mournful wails, and I knew that the malevolent force that had haunted the house for so long was now intent on claiming me. In the darkened room, I could see the shapes of the shadows moving against the walls, their twisted forms stretching and distorting as they pressed in from all sides. I could feel their cold fingers brushing against my skin, and their whispers grew louder, more insistent. I realized that the shadows were not just a part of the house. They were a part of me now, and they would not let me escape. As the night wore on, I felt my strength waning. The shadows seemed to feed on my fear, growing more powerful with each passing moment. I could feel my mind slipping away, the darkness closing in around me. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the cracks in the curtains, I knew that I had to leave the Hawthorne House, or risk becoming a permanent part of its dark legacy. But as I prepared to flee, I realized that the shadows were already closing in, and the house would not let me go so easily. The darkness had claimed me, and there was no escaping the haunting presence that lurked within the walls of the Hawthorne House. The shadows had awakened, and they were hungry for more than just my fear. They were hungry for my very soul. I fled the confines of the Hawthorne House with a sense of desperation that bordered on madness. My heart raced as I stumbled through the oppressive darkness of the garden, my mind struggling to make sense of the malevolent forces that seemed to be closing in on me. The shadows that had been mere figments of my imagination were now tangible, their presence a suffocating weight that threatened to crush me. The cool night air did little to ease the burning fear that coursed through me. I made my way to the nearby town, seeking refuge in the familiar surroundings of Salem. The streets, though usually comforting, now seemed alien and hostile, their quietude a stark contrast to the cacophony of terror I had just experienced. Desperate for answers, I sought out the local historian, a reclusive man named Arthur Hawks, who was reputed to know more about Salem's dark past than anyone else. His home was an old colonial house on the edge of town, surrounded by a high, wrought-iron fence that seemed to keep both the world and its secrets at bay. When I arrived, I found him sitting by the fire, his eyes tired but sharp. Arthur listened intently as I recounted my experiences, his expression growing increasingly grave. "The Hawthorne House is notorious," he said finally. "It's not just about the witch trials. There are darker forces at work, forces that have been lurking in the shadows for centuries." He explained that Jonathan Hawthorne, the previous owner of the house, had been involved in occult practices far more sinister than mere superstitions. According to local legend, he had attempted to harness the power of ancient, malevolent entities to gain wealth and influence. His rituals were said to involve human sacrifices, and it was believed that the shadows of those sacrificed still lingered, trapped between realms. Arthur's revelations only deepened my sense of dread. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of an abyss, and the house was pulling me back toward it. I knew I had to return to the Hawthorne House to uncover the truth and free myself from the malevolent grip that had taken hold of me. That night, I returned to the Hawthorne House with a renewed determination. The air was colder than before, and the oppressive silence of the house seemed even more palpable. The shadows in the hallway seemed to writhe and twist, their movements more pronounced in the flickering light of my flashlight. I made my way back to the basement, driven by an overwhelming urge to understand what lay behind the dark veil that had descended upon the house. The journal I had found earlier had mentioned an underground chamber, a hidden space where the most forbidden rituals were performed. I had to find this chamber and confront whatever lay within. The basement was even more eerie than before. The air was thick with a musty odor, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I noticed a loose stone in one of the walls, its edges crumbling with age. With a sense of trepidation, I pried it open, revealing a small, dark passageway behind it. The passage was narrow and winding, its walls damp and covered in mold. I had to crawl through it, each movement echoing through the darkness like a soft, sinister whisper. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning until I could barely tell which direction I was moving in. Eventually, the passage opened into a large underground chamber. The room was vast, its walls adorned with strange symbols and arcane writings that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. In the center of the chamber was an altar, similar to the one I had seen earlier but much more elaborate. The altar was covered in dark stains, and the air around it was thick with an acrid, metallic smell. On the altar lay a book, bound in black leather and adorned with a symbol that seemed to pulse with an eerie, unnatural energy. The book was open to a page that detailed a ritual of summoning, a dark incantation that promised to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. My hands trembled as I reached for the book, my fingers brushing against the cold, leather cover. As I read the incantation, a cold breeze swept through the chamber, extinguishing my flashlight and plunging me into darkness. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on me. The shadows seemed to coalesce, forming dark, writhing shapes that moved closer and closer. A low, guttural growl filled the air, and I could hear whispers growing louder, more insistent. The voices seemed to come from all directions, their words a tangled mess of anger and sorrow. I tried to make out the words, but they were drowned out by the rising cacophony. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me, a cold, clammy hand gripping my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. The shadows seemed to close in around me, their movements growing more frenzied. I could see the shapes of the entities that had been summoned, their forms twisted and distorted by the dark magic that had been invoked. Panicked, I stumbled out of the chamber and back through the passageway. The shadows seemed to follow me, their whispers growing louder and more aggressive. I crawled back through the passage, my heart pounding in my chest. The oppressive darkness of the basement seemed to close in on me, and I could feel the cold, malevolent presence of the entities growing stronger. When I finally emerged into the basement, I was gasping for breath, my body shaking with fear. I made my way back up the stairs, the shadows still clinging to me, their whispers echoing in my ears. I knew that the house was now more dangerous than ever, and I was no longer just a visitor. I was part of its dark legacy. Leaving the Hawthorne House behind was both a relief and a source of deep, unsettling anxiety. The oppressive weight of the shadows had lifted, but the lingering sense of dread seemed to follow me wherever I went. I had hoped that the ritual had freed me from the clutches of the malevolent entities, but the memories of my time in that accursed house haunted me day and night. Salem seemed unchanged by my ordeal. The town continued its daily routines with a disconcerting normalcy, as if the horrors I had faced were nothing more than figments of my imagination. I tried to return to my old life, but the darkness had left its mark on me in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I felt like a ghost wandering through a world that no longer made sense. The weeks following the ritual were marked by a series of unsettling events. I experienced vivid nightmares, each one more disturbing than the last. In these dreams, I found myself back in the Hawthorne House, trapped in an ever-shifting maze of shadows. The malevolent entities were always just out of sight, their whispers a constant presence in the darkness. I would wake in a cold sweat, the feeling of being watched lingering long after I was fully awake. Despite my attempts to find solace in everyday activities, I found it increasingly difficult to escape the feeling of being pursued. I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures in my peripheral vision, only to turn and find nothing there. The sense of paranoia grew with each passing day, and I began to avoid the places I once frequented, fearing that the shadows had followed me out of the house. In an effort to regain some semblance of normalcy, I sought professional help. I spoke to therapists and counselors, but no one seemed to fully understand the depth of my trauma. I described the shadows, the whispers, and the dark entities, but their responses were dismissive, chalking my experiences up to stress or psychological distress. I felt increasingly isolated, unable to share the true nature of my fear with those around me. One evening, as I was preparing to leave my apartment, I noticed a strange figure standing across the street. The figure was shrouded in darkness, and I could barely make out its features. It seemed to be watching me, its presence a stark reminder of the malevolent forces that had once haunted me. I tried to convince myself that it was just a figment of my imagination, but the unease never left me. I decided to return to Salem, hoping that revisiting the town might provide some closure. I drove back to the Hawthorne House, the journey filled with a growing sense of dread. The house, now seemingly abandoned, loomed over me as I approached. Its once imposing presence now felt oddly muted, as if the malevolent force had retreated but not entirely vanished. The house was as I had left it, dusty and silent, with the shadows lurking in every corner. I spent hours walking through the rooms, trying to reconcile my experiences with the tangible reality of the place. The atmosphere was heavy with a sense of foreboding, but there were no signs of the dark entities that had once plagued me. It was as if the house had been waiting for my return, a silent witness to the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. As night fell, I felt an almost magnetic pull toward the basement. The memory of the underground chamber and the dark ritual was still fresh in my mind. I descended the stairs with a mixture of apprehension and determination, knowing that I needed to confront the shadows once more. The basement was as I had remembered it, a place of darkness and decay. The altar remained in the center of the room, its dark stains a stark reminder of the rituals that had taken place. The book I had found lay on the floor, its black leather cover now slightly torn. I picked it up, my hands trembling as I opened it to the page containing the summoning incantation. As I read the words aloud, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the room, and the temperature dropped abruptly. The shadows in the basement began to stir, their forms coalescing into the twisted shapes of the entities I had once faced. The whispers started again, their voices a dissonant chorus of anger and sorrow. I realized that the malevolent force had not been fully vanquished. It had merely been lying in wait, biding its time. The shadows seemed to surge forward, their presence overwhelming and oppressive. I could feel their anger and frustration, their dark power pressing in on me from all sides. Desperate to end the nightmare once and for all, I completed the counter-ritual once more, my voice rising above the cacophony of whispers. The candles flared brightly, casting a pure, radiant light that pushed back the shadows. The entities writhed and twisted, their forms distorting as they were driven away by the light. The room was filled with an eerie calm as the shadows receded. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on me lifted, and the silence that followed was profound. I felt a fleeting sense of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the darkness had not been completely eradicated. It had merely been pushed back, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. In the days that followed, I continued to struggle with the lingering effects of my experiences. The nightmares persisted, and the sense of paranoia remained, as if the shadows had left a permanent mark on my psyche. My return to Salem had provided some temporary relief, but the darkness was still very much a part of me. As I attempted to piece together the fragments of my life, I began to notice subtle changes. Objects in my apartment would be displaced, and I would hear faint whispers when alone. The shadows seemed to have found their way into my everyday existence, their presence a constant reminder of the horrors I had faced. One night, as I was lying in bed, I was awoken by a sudden chill. The room was colder than usual, and I could see my breath fogging in the air. I sat up, my heart pounding, and noticed a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. Its shape was indistinct, but I could feel its malevolent gaze upon me. The figure seemed to beckon me, its presence a silent invitation to follow. Despite my fear, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to obey. I got out of bed and followed the figure through the apartment, its form shifting and distorting as it moved. The whispers grew louder, their words a jumble of incomprehensible sounds. The figure led me to a hidden door in the hallway, one that I had never noticed before. The door was old and weathered, its surface covered in strange symbols. I hesitated for a moment, but the figure's presence was too compelling to ignore. I opened the door, revealing a small, dimly lit room. Inside the room was a large, ornate mirror, similar to the one I had seen in the Hawthorne House. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of dust, but its surface seemed to emit a faint, otherworldly glow. I approached the mirror cautiously, my reflection barely visible through the haze. As I gazed into the mirror, I saw the figure standing behind me, its features now clear and distinct. It was a woman, her face etched with sorrow and rage. Her eyes, dark and hollow, stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. She reached out toward me, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to reach through. The whispers grew louder, their voices a dissonant chorus of anguish and despair. I could feel the cold touch of the woman's hand on the other side of the mirror, her presence a tangible force that seemed to reach into my very soul. I realized that she was not just a mere apparition, she was a part of the darkness that had consumed the Hawthorne House. Desperate to break free from her grasp, I turned away from the mirror and fled the room. The whispers followed me, their voices growing more frantic and desperate. I raced through the apartment, my fear mounting as I tried to escape the shadows that seemed to be closing in on me. The apartment became a labyrinth of darkness, the shadows twisting and writhing as I stumbled through. I could hear the woman's anguished cries echoing through the hallways, her presence a constant, oppressive weight. My panic reached its peak as I felt the shadows closing in on me, their malevolent energy pressing down with an almost physical force. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, I fled outside into the cold night air. The darkness of the street seemed to press in on me, the shadows lurking in every corner. I ran through the streets of Salem, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to outrun the darkness. Eventually, I collapsed in an alleyway, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The whispers had faded, and the shadows seemed to have receded. I was left alone in the silence, the weight of my experiences crashing down upon me. As I sat in the alley, I began to understand the true nature of the darkness that had plagued me. It was not merely a force to be vanquished, it was a part of me, a reflection of the fears and anxieties that had taken hold of my soul. The shadows had been a manifestation of my own inner turmoil, and their presence was a reminder of the darkness that lay within. In the days that followed, I continued to struggle with the remnants of my experiences. The nightmares and whispers gradually faded, but the shadows remained a part of my life. I had faced the darkness and survived, but the scars of my ordeal would never fully heal. Salem remained a place of both fascination and fear for me. The town's history was intertwined with the darkness of the Hawthorne House, and the shadows would always be a part of its legacy. As I moved forward with my life, I carried the weight of my experiences with me, a constant reminder of the darkness that had once consumed me. In the end, the Hawthorne House was more than just a place of horror. It was a reflection of the shadows that lay within each of us. The darkness had been confronted, but it remained an ever-present force, waiting in the corners of our minds and the shadows of our lives. The echoes of despair would continue to resonate, a reminder of the darkness that lies within us all.